Maura McInerney, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And it's my pleasure to introduce you to her. She's a senior staff attorney at the Education Law Center. She's a founding member of the Legal Center for Foster Care and Education. And her education law practice focuses on the legal rights of children and youth in foster care. But most importantly, Maura has been a litigator in the private and public sectors for over 20 years. And any of the attorneys in here that are litigators realize that that's difficult but rewarding work, and she has been in the trenches. She previously clerked for the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit and was an Assistant Attorney General for the state of Maryland. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce Maura McInerney. Thank you.
How are you? Can you all hear me? I'm usually pretty loud and I don't need a microphone. Is that great? Do we have anyone in the room that works in early intervention? Excellent. Where do you work?
I'm the state coordinator, one of the state coordinators for early intervention.
Oh, that's terrific. Thank you so much for coming. Really appreciate it. Yes, right behind her.
I'm Coach Lewis. I'm an early development network services coordinator.
Great, great. Anyone else who works in early intervention? Yes.
I'm a primary service provider in the subdivision for
Great.
and I'm a school psychologist that works in intervention.
That's fabulous. Thank you so much. I'm really glad that you all identified yourselves, and I'm hoping that you can help me as we go through the presentation to kind of fill in gaps and tell us how it works in Nebraska. My name is Maura McInerney. I'm from the Education Law Center in Philadelphia. And the Education Law Center is part of a collaboration called the Legal Center for Foster Care and Education, which combines the ABA Center on Children in the Law, the Juvenile Law Center, and the Education Law Center to focus on one thing: improving educational outcomes for kids in the foster care system nationwide. So as part of that work, we really look at what's going on in different states and try to develop a series of policies, practices, legislation that we think is model work that might be replicated in other states. So as we walk through this, I'm going to talk about some things that may be going on in other places and things that have been identified as being model practices. I really don't have a clicker. Maybe there's not a clicker. Yes. No? Okay. Step over here. Okay. So I think we've gone over that. The website is noted there, and it's actually a very useful website because you can search it by issue, by database, and it collects things from all across the country. So you can look at Nebraska, Massachusetts, whatever states, and it's searchable in many different areas. And one thing that I did want to mention is that we have developed something called Blueprint for Change. That's the name of the document. And it is essentially a document that identifies 8 goals to improve educational outcomes for youth in the foster care system. One of those goals is school stability, another is student transitions and common enrollment, and one of those is focused on kids before they enter school, improving educational outcomes in school. So it talks a lot about early intervention. That's helpful. So as you walk through that book, it provides some models in states and jurisdictions, what's going on, that's helpful, but it also identifies benchmarks with respect to each goal. So for example, to ensure that children enter school ready to learn, it'll have a series of benchmarks that you should consider, one of them being early intervention. And I really wanted to spend a moment before we get started talking about why this is such an important issue. This is some data from Nebraska. Folks in the room may be familiar with this. Thank you for the information. Really, really helpful. So as you will see, in 2003, CAPTA enacted, which is a federal law, said that children who are neglected or abused should be screened for early intervention services. Is everybody familiar with that requirement? Okay. 2005, the IDEA, the Special Education Law, essentially incorporated that requirement into the federal act, saying that children who were abused or neglected needed to be screened for early intervention services. So perhaps someone else, actually the expert in the room, can speak about this issue. But what it looks like to me is that you are doing extremely well in screening children. Is that correct? That you have an automated system in place? Can you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, we have an automated system for referrals. So every time Child Protective Service worker goes into the NFOCUS data system and substantiates a case, and that's either agency substantiated, court substantiated, or court pending, that referral for a child under the age of 3 automatically comes over and speaks to the early intervention database. It does a name and a name search, a date of birth search. If there's a match already in the early intervention database that we received that referral already on that kid, that's great. It kicks it back and says we got the referral. If there's no match, then it'll automatically bring it over and code a new referral into the early intervention database. So by region, to the appropriate region. So if it's for the Omaha region, for Cody's area, when she logs on the next morning, it clues her that there's a new capture referral for her to go in and open up and start working on. And it pulls all the demographic information from NFOCUS, such as, like I said, the child's information as well as the foster parent information that's coded in there, bio parents information. So she has some good information to start working with when she opens up that referral. And your caseworker information is on there too.
So this is fabulous. You have 100% of kids in the state that are being screened, that are required to be screened. So that's,
They're being referred.
but being referred. We talk about screening assessment, so you talk about referred and then assessed.
Then evaluated. Then evaluated.
So if you could just walk through it for us. So those are the kids that are referred, and what percentage are screened?
So out of the 1971, that's last calendar year, that's the number of cases or of children that were substantiated and referred over to the early development network, early intervention program in our state. So out of that 1971, if you go to the very next line, 481, that is the number of evaluations that we were able to conduct in our state. That the parents, the biological parents, have their rights intact, as we know, educational rights intact in our state. So that was the number that they consented to the evaluation being done, and that the evaluation was conducted on those number of children. Out of that 481 in which evaluations were conducted, then 136 of those children were found eligible for early intervention services. If you go to the left, so that's a fairly small number of children that were evaluated and then served. So then we have all these other children that were not evaluated nor served. So why is that? So the box on the left talks about 696 of those referrals. Those biological parents refused to either have their child screened or evaluated by our program. They just absolutely refused to participate in the process whatsoever. 411 of the children could not be located by the early development network. So they got the referral, they went out and tried to locate the family, they do some follow-up contacts with the Child Protective Service worker and still couldn't locate the family. 203 of the kids, the families were contacted and a screening was done. So we did a child assessment screening, a validated tool, and it showed that the child was found to be developing appropriately. They gathered medical records, they gathered court records, foster parents, bio parents, CPS worker did not have any concerns for the development of the child, as well as an independent observation by the early intervention provider showed the child was developing normally, therefore the evaluation was not needed. And then there was 23 of the children that moved out of state after we got the referral, so we could follow up on that. Now what we do is we then contact the other states' early intervention program for them to follow up on that.
So this is important to look at and to recall as we sort of walk through the presentation today to see where we are. So the referrals are being made, and that's big, and that's important. We do have a very high number, it seems to me, from looking at other states, a high number of parents that are refusing to provide consent in this state. Can someone in the room speak about that process? How is it that parents are contacted? How is this explained to them? Is anyone in the room in that role of talking to the biological parent and explaining what early intervention services are, why they might make a difference, who could Is anyone,
I guess that's a little bit.
I'm looking at you.
Of what we do. Typically, when we first get that referral, my first contact is always going to be with the caseworker to find out, are there concerns? Because, we may contact the parent and they may not know what typical development is. And so I always make that first contact with the caseworker. But then in following up with the parent, kind of like what you said, explain a little bit about what exactly is our program, the different steps that we would go through, and then what services, if their child is eligible, they would be able to have access to as far as services and supports. And
That conversation's not going too well. Or,
well, I guess I usually have a pretty good success rate.
What are the typical reasons people say, I don't want my child to?
The parent might just say they don't have any concerns.
Right. That the child seems to be doing fine.
Yep. So,
which is actually a typical response of a lot of parents on this issue. Does anyone agree with that? That sometimes most parents are like, well, they seem okay, right?
Or we get infants, and not a lot of times they just kind of feel that, there's not a need.
Right.
So again, we just kind of go over, yes, there's not expectations, but these are some things, and, we can also do some education.
Right.
About some things to look for in the future, and, yeah. So, I really couldn't tell you exactly why parents.
No, I know that. I know.
Yeah,
I just wanted to really get a
try
sense,
to-
because that's a fairly high statistic.
Yep, and we just really try to get on.
Yes, that's a question about the 21% that live in the other table.
Yeah, I was going to just ask about that one too. How is it that we're not able to locate, the children have been referred to the network and you're following up, and are these children that are remaining with biological parent at the time and you can't locate the biological, or how does that happen?
It's a plethora of reasons when I analyze the data. It's one big factor that appears to be happening in this data is many times when CPS is substantiating the case on the database, that's several months after the fact that we're really working with the family a lot of times. So the case was really closed in action, and now I'm catching up my paperwork a couple months or 3 months later and going into the database to substantiate the case. And I can say that because I'm a former CPS worker for 12 years, and I'm just as guilty as anybody, is waiting until 2 or 3 months later when I had to sit down at my computer and actually enter that finding and wrap up my case on my computer. So by the time, then that's automatically coming over now, 3 months after the fact, and so the family's gone. Or the family says, I don't have any reason to participate with you. I'm done with this. So many times the families are gone. They're not at that address any longer. The other way that we don't have access to families, or they decline to, or that we can't locate them, is just good old-fashioned lack of communication and collaboration. So we wait several weeks to get return phone calls from CPS because they're very busy with the changes in the system, where we have a case manager under HHS, and we have, private agencies also delivering services, and you change from an IA worker to an ongoing worker, and all those different nuances. It may take us several weeks to get connected to the right caseworker who, and also in that time frame, the child has been moved. We started out with a referral with a specific foster parent, or we thought they were in the bio home, because that's what the referral says. But by the time we connect with the family, that child's been moved to maybe from a foster home to a kinship placement. We're trying to get the CPS worker to return our call to tell us the new information about where this child is placed, and trying to make all those connections. And then, so what we're trying to do is an effort of communication where not only are they contacting CPS, but they're contacting the guardian ad litem in the case. And that the early intervention folks go to any pre-hearing conference that's being scheduled, or any family team meeting. If we can get, again, a hold of the right people to find out that information, we could show up there and get that information. But many times they'll play several weeks of catch-up tag, and we just can't make the connections, and so we end up closing out the case because we just simply can't locate the family. We're getting better, I think, at that.
because we've had some targeted efforts in local areas around that huge number of declined by parents. These local teams, and many of you in the room probably can speak to that better, that you're through the eyes of the child teams and your 1184 teams are doing a better job at focusing on this and doing some cooperation and collaboration around getting EDN connected to locating those parents.
Maura,
So, yes,
a large number of parents have declined. If you have an active case,
right.
do you accept a consent by a GAL?
No, we can't. Only the biological parent can consent to the screening and the evaluation and services. Because education rights for biological parents are being intact in our state. Unless there's a court order. The judge can order.
I was going to say the judge could get involved, because the guardian ad litem is a substitute parent.
Well, usually it's a biological, your state law may be different, that's why feel free to jump in. It's a biological parent, it's a legal guardian, it's the IDEA parent as that is defined under federal law, is usually adopted in state law. So it's a biological parent, a foster parent, a person acting as a parent in the absence of a parent with whom the child lives, not the GAL, with whom the child lives. If you have a different definition.
We have a restricted state law.
Okay.
So our state law has restricted that biological parents retain their educational rights, so we cannot enact immediately.
No, we agree that they do, and they do under federal law as well. But that's why I was saying that there are other people as well. And I understand that under federal law, federal regulations say that it remains the biological parent unless we have a court who appoints. Or if they're in certain very specific situations of there isn't a biological parental rights are terminated, whereabouts the parents are unknown, then the district can appoint. Yes.
What he was going to make, when you get into those situations,
Right.
you simply transfer those educational rights either the caseworker, the GL, or someone else.
Well, you can't transfer it to the caseworker because that's prohibited by federal law. But you can transfer those to some other education decision maker for the child. The court can always do that. And that's one of the things that I wanted to highlight here. That if one of the problems is the parental consent, you're not supposed to, the federal law says as long as the parent is active and involved and wants to serve in this role, they can say, I don't want these services. However, if you don't have a parent who's active and involved, then that's an opportunity for a court to appoint someone in those situations.
Well,
Yes.
now can the GAL then, or the appointed person, also, so they consent for the evaluation, but then can they also consent for services?
Okay, so this is a very good question. The GAL, and there's federal guidance on this if anyone wants to see it, that says that a GAL can serve as a child special education decision maker. But that person would have to be appointed by a court. That person cannot step into that role and do that. Yes.
In our state, it's going to be the school district because the referral goes to the school district.
Right.
They can't locate the biological parents, and they have the response, and they have to have certain steps they have to follow. And they can appoint a surrogate, and that would probably
Yes.
be the foster family.
That is
Who
under,
can then
yes.
sign for the evaluation, and if the child is eligible for services, they'll sign for those services.
That is true under federal law. Under federal law, within 30 days, a school district will appoint a surrogate parent in 3 specific situations. Parental rights are terminated or parents are deceased. That's sort of 2 different situations. The parents cannot be located after reasonable efforts are found, or then there's another rule that applies for another child. So in those instances, the school district actually has a mandated obligation to appoint a surrogate parent. However, any of that can be trumped by court. A court can always appoint in those situations. But this may be an issue that folks need to look at, both with respect to communication. How is this being communicated to families? That's something to look at, and something that Massachusetts and other states have really done a lot of work on to ensure that it's being communicated in a positive way, that this will make a difference in the life of their child, and this is really important. And then to also look, if you don't have a parent who's actively involved, whether it's a situation where you should appoint.
I need to say one more clarification too, so that people aren't under the wrong impression. You probably know this, but it's important to say that these are not members representing the state boards.
that all works well when it's a state board situation. And I think it is working well, and all those things that Maura just talked about. It goes much, much smoother when it's a state board situation because you can go through those channels and get those things done. But that's really a small number of kids that are really state boards that, there's a small number.
Do you know the number of children of this number that are wards of the state?
I don't.
Okay.
It's not sensitive.
Okay.
But our legal systems are talking to be able to do that.
But I didn't think that a high number are, no? This is
This is all,
or is this all referral?
this is all agency substantiated case. So it can be agency substantiated or court substantiated.
Right.
And because we have, like we talked about earlier, a high number of children in, voluntary services for, or we just go out and investigate it. Maybe it's a law enforcement ticket for neglect, lack of supervision. But you guys go in and agency substantiate because they went to court, they were found guilty of that ticket, so you go in. But you never really did anything with that family. But because you substantiated it, then that mandates a referral coming over. So it's those kinds of cases too that are coming into this
Right.
play.
Right.
So when it is
That's a really good
a state board, it's much easier to do those channels and it's working, I think, okay. We can almost improve. But it's all those that really, are not state board situations that you really find that declined by parent or unable to be located is a real factor.
And we have to remember that a lot of different agencies can also refer. This is just looking at substantiated case of abuse and neglect. Or is it looking at affected by illegal substance abuse?
Yes.
Does that included in that statistic as well? Or withdrawal symptoms resulting from prenatal drug use? That's all within the child find obligation under Nebraska law.
Well, these are captive cases.
Okay.
So if it was a captive case and the results in the
Right.
So these are captive.
So these are just the captive.
These are just captive.
Okay.
We really have over 6,000 referrals that come in every year.
Okay. So there's 6,000 referrals.
Yeah, this is just out of the cap, right, the number. Okay.
But that's something that underlies our discussion today. We're going to talk in a moment about why this is a really important intervention and everything. I'm sorry to put you on the spot there, by the way. But we also have to remind ourselves that there is a child find obligation. How many school district folks are in the room? Raise your hand if you're a school district. Okay. So the child find obligation that you see in the special education context for children who are in, there is a child find obligation as well for these young children. Okay, for these children who are, before they get to school, 0 to 5, it's a Part C. And that's embedded in federal law and reflected also in your state law, where it talks about these particular subset of kids, the children under age 3, in a substantiated case of abuse and neglect, identified as affected by illegal substance abuse, withdrawal symptoms resulting from prenatal drug use, or a child suspected of having a disability. And we have this obligation in multiple systems. There should be medical systems that are referring children for early intervention services. There are trainings that go on, and medical personnel need to know how to do it and need to respond to that. We have a number of agencies all need to report this as part of the child find obligation. And then the obligation after that is within 45 days of notice by the public agency or by Nebraska Human Health and Human Services. School district must complete multidisciplinary evaluation in accordance with obviously the consent and all the other things. And then, of course, you have the IFSP thing. But all of that is after you've evaluated the child, after you've determined that they're eligible, and all of that kicks in. Okay, so that's sort of an overview of where we are. I'd like to go through some other issues as well. So this is sort of your short history on children with disabilities. 1975, we had the Education for All Handicapped Children's Act. Then it was reauthorized as IDEA. And then there was this explosion of research on infancy and early childhood development. Ages 0 to 3, rapid brain and central nervous system development, early brain plasticity. Everyone might remember from yesterday when we were looking at the brain of a child who's developing normally, the neuronal connections are being made and things are happening and growing, and the brain actually gets larger. And then you have the cortex, and you have the brain of the child who doesn't have that stimulus, who isn't getting that, who is abused and neglected. And it actually looks different. and those neuronal connections are not being made, the brain is actually smaller, physically smaller than the brain of a child who's developing normally. All of this is happening in those 3 years. It's a huge, huge time of growth. It's the most, it's really incredible what goes on in those first 3 years. So we're going to talk about why this is important. So there's research on infant stimulation, and this is some of the research from that, if anyone's interested in looking at this. So 1986, the reauthorization of the IDEA encouraged states to develop 0 to 3 services for infants and toddlers with disabilities. So this was just as a prevention. So I wanted to mention, okay. Just early interventions that were clear about what it is: services, education, and support to children birth through 5 who have an existing delay, a physical or mental condition with a high probability of developmental delay. So a lot of these identification of kids are really saying these children may have a developmental delay. That's why we're looking at kids who have a substantiated case of abuse and neglect, or children who were drug exposed. We're looking at those children saying they are at risk. They may fall into this category. They may develop a developmental delay, or they may already be experiencing a delay. So children at risk of developing a delay or special needs may affect their development and their education. So before we go on, I'm putting some slides there, but I just wanted to mention a few research issues. So these are just go through the types of services. Direct impact on the child, structured experiences, developmental therapy, structure. These are the types of services that we're looking at in early intervention context. And also indirectly impact the child by working with the caregiver. So the early intervention system as a whole is working not only with the child, right, but we're working with the family. So instead of having an IEP, you have a family intervention program, a family system. Yes.
I'm sorry, I just want to clarify too for people in this room so they understand how early intervention in Nebraska works. Early intervention, the Early Development Network is birth to 3 in Nebraska. So when we're talking about those referrals coming over, those are for birth to 3 kids up to age, so it's any kid under the age of 3. Those referrals come over. You can still make referrals if you have concerns about delays in children older than 3, the 3 to 5 age group. You can make those referrals through the EDN, but we're going to pass those over to the same school district. And they will do the same types of things that we've talked about, an evaluation and assessment, and if they're found eligible, then they'll go on IEP, individual education plan that she just talked about. And children birth 2, 3, and early intervention receive the Individualized Family Service Plan, IFSP. So I just want to make sure, because some people get very confused that early intervention EDN in our state is birth to 5. It's really not, it's birth to 3, but school districts serve children birth to 21. Hope that helps.
No, that's very, very helpful. And every state is different in terms of how they differentiate, so that's very helpful. Thank you. I just wanted to mention, and I know you've heard a lot about this during the conference, about the importance of these early ages, but it's really where that's the actually most rapid rate of human learning development is happening, is in these first 3 years, so that's really important. And this is the time to intervene because we really are on a very different trajectory if you don't. I wanted to mention Washington State, 2004 did a study. It's on a website called Washington Institute for Public Policy. And they were looking at early intervention. Does it matter? Is it cost effective? Is it a good investment? Is it not? And the research findings included that a child's participation in early intervention services absolutely improved educational outcomes. But it also had a lot of other impacts that they weren't expecting to find. It actually reduced crime. They were less likely to engage in substance abuse and decreased teen pregnancy for that cohort. It reduced teen suicide. It reduced domestic violence. Another study that was done found that children were able to enter school. They were able to handle their emotions better. They were able to engage in trusting relationships, use social skills. They were able to engage in the classroom if they had early intervention services, and better able to learn. And most importantly, they were less likely to need special education services later. They were less likely to have more severe developmental delays or developmental delays at all. So that's really important to look at. So the idea here is that regardless of biological variability or life experiences, that we needed to be intervening at this early age. And we really needed to intervene with the child's primary caregivers because those are the people that are stimulating the child during the day, either doing or not doing it. You know, there's a study recently that was done that looked at a child who is, you know, an infant. You think, well, what can an infant, how does trauma impact? It has a severe and significant impact on brain development. It isn't just if they were the victim of abuse, it's if they witnessed abuse, if they witnessed trauma, that they experienced trauma. We know that children in the dependency system, apparently they experience greater post-traumatic stress than people who go to war. So it's really important to understand that even as a child, their brains, they're actually impacted by what's going on around them. And neglect is a huge factor. It isn't just, abuse when they see it or they do. It's the act of neglect is a bigger factor for young children. They're in the crib and no one is responding. They're crying and no one answers. So they learn a very different way of interacting with the world as a result of that. They know that if they cry out, they keep doing that nothing's going to happen. That need for attachment, they don't know how to, they have an attachment disorder later in life. All of those things are huge and they start when a child is extremely young. So one of the studies that I looked at talked about the brain development of a child, when you don't respond and what happens by virtue of not responding to that child. It's really incredibly sad, actually. So early intervention services increase the child's opportunity for learning. They lessen the effect of disability physically, cognitively, with respect to communication, social, emotional development, and adaptive development. It improves the functioning of families. That is huge. It improves the functioning of families. And of course, it has incredibly long-term benefits for society. So it's important to look at that. Now, there's an interesting study that was done in 2009, Early Intervention State Policy Study by the National Institute of Health, and it looked across the 50 states at early intervention, and looked at the variables. In our nation, between 23% and 83% in some states of children have early intervention services, participate in early intervention. That's a huge disparity from 23 to 40. So the average 45.7%. Early intervention is you're less likely to have people participating in early intervention if you're less early intervention restrictor, which makes sense. If your eligibility criteria are higher, you're less likely to have children that are participating in that. But the children who do participate are less likely, a big factor is poverty. And also, the children who do participate are less likely to have developmental delays and more likely to have positive outcomes later. So these are some of the results that we've looked at: increasing developmental and educational gains, results in needing fewer special education and other rehabilitative services, less likely to be retained and trained, and in some cases being indistinguishable from classmates who have disabilities. Higher levels of school readiness, standardized test scores, future academic attainment. So those are some of the studies that we've done. Lower rates of grade retention, special education. Higher rates of parent participation, because this is really, early intervention services are very, very parent focused. Could you speak to that issue about the role of the parent or the caregiver in the case of some kids who are in the dependency system?
But obviously the role of the parent is paramount. It's a family-centered program, so just like we talked earlier, parents, or if the bio parent isn't available, we have a foster parent instead. That is the caregiver in the family unit for that family. They sign everything. We can't hold a meeting without a family member, without the caregiver present. We consent for services, like we said, by the family. The family chooses what their concerns, their priorities are in the development of the child. That's what we work on in the plan. They structure the plan, they chair the meetings. The services coordinators are key in helping families understand their rights and helping them to be able to advocate for themselves and to eventually chair their family meetings, the IFSP meetings. The services are delivered at a time and location convenient to the family. The meetings are held in that manner as well, but services, they get to choose, do I want the providers to come into my home? Do I want them to go to my home and grandma's home because grandma's caring for the child too? Do I want them to go to the child care to deliver the services? So they're really paramount in shaping that plan and determining what the services are and how those services will look. So that, and again, the whole goal is to support the family in supporting the development of the child, so that, just like she was saying, eventually there's not a need for continued intervention because the family is able to be able to support the development through all across the family's routines and all across the family settings. It's not that we bring babies into a classroom and do work with them at the school district. We're doing things in the family's home and across settings and routines that are individual and unique to them. So every case looks a little bit differently in how we deliver our services because of that.
That's really important. So what you're really doing, thank you so much, you're changing the family environment for the child. That's really the bottom line what we're trying to do. So remember, children in the foster care system, over half experience developmental delays. They're incredibly high risk of developmental delays. This is 4 to 5 times the rate of the general population. Nearly 80% are at risk for a wide range of medical and developmental delays. So one of the points I wanted to make here is that it isn't enough to just look at substantiated cases of abuse and neglect under CAPTA. You check the box, you say, well, if they have that, they're going to get referred and everything will be fine. There are a group of children in the foster care system that are experiencing developmental delays in these early years, and you may not have a substantiated case of abuse or neglect. You may not have a drug-dependent situation or an exposure in utero. You may not have those other factors, or it's also exposure to violence is another risk factor. And that child may still be at risk of developmental delay. So it's just something to keep in mind, that it isn't just that one allegation that moves the needle. It's looking at the whole child and trying to see if they may have a suspected developmental delay. Nearly 80% are at risk for a wide range of medical developmental problems. More than 40% are below birth weight, premature, 2 factors which increase the likelihood of developmental delays. So in some states, they have actually broadened their criteria for early intervention. And they look at, was the baby low weight? Is that a factor that we want to say that every child needs to be screened at that point? So it's important to look at that. So children abused or neglected experience far higher rates of physical developmental and emotional problems, including attachment disorders, social and emotional disturbances, cognitive deficits, neurobiological changes to the brain, and a failure to thrive. And we know from the discussion about trauma, where we were talking about the reducing the size of the cortex, the abnormal brain development, reduced neuronal connections, and also the stress hormone dysregulation that you see in infant and toddler. So this is most at risk. Risk is greatest in the very young. Birth to 3 have the highest rates of victimization in terms of abuse and neglect, and exposure to trauma as well. More than 3/4 of the estimated 1,460 children who died as a result of child abuse and neglect that year before. How many in, I think it's over 50% that are 0 to 5 in Nebraska that are in the dependency system, is that right? I believe it's over 50%. Anyone? Okay. I think that's what I read, so I think that's probably. So there are a lot of children who fall in the end of the justice. So 1/4 of these are national statistics. 1/4 already have significant delays in motor development, so that's one issue to really be looking at. 1/2 have significant delays in communication and cognitive development. Do we use the ages and stages screen here? That's the most common one that's used above. So CAPTA, I think we've already discussed this, and we're clear on what this is, right? Referral to child under age 3 is involved in substantiate cases of abuse and neglect.
Chris Ashton said,
That is the Child Abuse Protection and Treatment Act, CAPTA. Keeping children and families safe. I'm sorry, because that's what they changed the name to. I used the old name, and I really apologize. I was bad. Okay. So when we talk about all of these laws, we talk about Part C. There's a Part B of the IDEA that refers to the school-age children. This is the first Part C of the IDEA. So the state role, each state develops its own definition of what a developmental delay is. So some might say it's a 25% delay in communication or in these cognitive skills. So everyone develops their own criteria for who's eligible for intervention services. The part that I read to you earlier was from the Nebraska law that talks about the developmental delay is. With respect to who's referred, that population that's referred, and there's a separate definition of developmental delay. So this is recent changes to Part C. If anyone here knows that it was recently revised with the regulations here, Congress added infants and toddlers in foster care to the Act's purpose clause to focus on kids in the dependency system. As historically underrepresented, they are underrepresented in terms of receiving early intervention services. So the referral might happen, the screening may or may not happen, the multidisciplinary evaluation may or may not happen. But the children receiving services is always a low percentage for kids in the dependency system, despite the documented developmental delays that we see in the population. So the state's lead agency is directed to ensure that the state's child find system targets infants and toddlers who are wards of the state, and that this system is coordinated with the efforts of the child protection and child welfare programs responsible for administering capital. They use the old name too. Part C regulations now require all infants and toddlers for whom abuse and neglect has been substantiated or who are identified as affected by illicit substance abuse or withdrawal symptoms resulting from prenatal drug exposure must be referred to the part system for screening and or evaluation. Okay? So that's very, very important that they just made those amendments this past year. I must have cut that off. Sorry about that. Primary referral sources now include public agencies and staff to the child welfare system, including child protective services and foster care, who were added as entities who are directed to refer children who may be in need of early intervention services within 7 calendar days. So we were talking before about when you get these referrals. So these are supposed to happen quickly. Everything in the early intervention context is very much sort of in a short time frame, consolidated. Because the thought is that these kids, time is of the essence, babies can't wait, right? We're used to hearing that. Well, it's really, really critical that these referrals be made in a timely manner. So this is directing states to come up with some plan to ensure that this is happening in a timely way. Definition of parent and word of the state and rules of surrogate parents were added or clarified, and now they align with what's in Part B, which is what we were talking about before in terms of when you refer to surrogate parents. And it sounds like you were saying that is not such a problem here. Okay. At least one member of the state interagency coordinating council must be from the child welfare agency responsible for foster care, and that has probably occurred here as well. That you have someone who's on that interagency. So there was a real focus on kids in the foster care system. So what's going wrong? Despite the well-documented need and eligibility, many children who have experienced abuse and neglect do not receive services. States nationwide report under-identification, under-enrollment of children in child welfare and in early intervention. And that study that I mentioned earlier that was done across the state had the same finding, that this is not happening. And it may be lack of coordination, communication between child welfare system and early intervention system. It also may be the consent issue and who can sign for the consent. Now, there are some states that have broadened that have said it can be either the biological parent or it can be the child welfare agent, or it can be someone else. So there are people who are doing it. You mentioned the GAL, that the feds have said that they can certainly be a person who can do that. So that's something that you would have to consider at a legislative level in your state about whether that is your issue, that the consent is the problem, whether there might be another way around that, and whether there needs to be perhaps a change to look at that. So while on referrals, quality of assessments and screenings, this is another key issue. So we have people being referred. Let's assume we've solved a consent problem, or we're getting consent, or we're finding a way that that's happening. What about the quality of the assessment and the screening? So I was mentioned to you earlier that I was going to talk about some of what was going on in other states. So the 50-state survey from Part C program coordinators and directors that was done in June of 2010. This is the Promoting Social Emotional Well-Being of Infants and Toddlers in Early Intervention Programs. It talked about the fact that ages and stages, and folks are also doing ages and stages for social and emotional development. Do you do that as well? You do both of those tools. So that's common screening tools. Requiring participation by mental health professionals as part of that screening. Do you do that as well? Are there
No requirements.
Okay, so that's something that is
Can be done, but there's no requirement.
Okay, so that's something that is being done in some of the other states, is to get mental health involved. So Massachusetts and New Mexico looked at standardized tools to assess risk factors for social and emotional evaluation. They found that this was one of the places where maybe kids in the dependency system were falling through the cracks, that they needed to really upgrade sort of what those assessments look like, try to develop that. There's also something called the Adopted Michigan AI Mental Health Competencies and Endorsements. I don't know if you're familiar with that one. But has specific skills needed by different early intervention professionals to allow them to sort of identify infants who may be at risk and kids who may need to be evaluated. So that was part of the training sort of tool. But the statewide assessment that was done said that what really matters is the value of that first assessment that's done. And who is doing it? So that's the other issue. It needs to be done by a qualified trained professional. In most cases, it's a service coordinator who's trained to do that. In your state, who is doing those, the first screenings? Who does them? Who does the ages and stages?
In our state, it's the school district, because that's where the referral goes. So the local school district is going to do the screening, and they're going to do, if the child is perceived to have a disability or delay, then the local school district will do the multidisciplinary evaluation.
Okay, so the first screening, before you do the multidisciplinary evaluation, the first screening is done by the school district.
Credential providers in early childhood, we have state criteria for credential, the teaching requirements for credential providers in state law.
Typically, it's done by our service units, or those folks if it's birth to age 3. After age 3, the school district has more hands-on, with the screening. And we work together with the Early Development Network, with our service unit at birth to 3.
So normally it's a service unit that would be doing that.
We would contract with
which
them.
might vary in the different school districts.
Right.
We have a lot of different school districts here, as I recall. So, but maybe done a little different.
I'm probably not the only one that wonders, what is this screening? When they see if the kid knows his colors, knows his numbers,
Can you explain
knows the day of the week, what do they?
Well, no, when they're 0 to 1, you're not really doing that, unless you're a really bright kid.
And I know there are other people in the room here that do it. They're looking across those developmental areas, cognitive, language, motor skills, self-help skills, to see what's appropriate for that child's age level. And we have out at our child find booth right here at the end, very end of the hall, we've just developed an app that we really would gladly, got a phone, hook it right up for developmental milestones. And that's what they're looking at. And she talks about ages and stages. Yeah, and there's an app for that, so it's not colors.
Right. So and it varies. You can look at a 1 month, look at a 2 month, look at a 3 month. You're looking at what should the child be doing at that moment in time. I mean, one of the problems I've seen in other states is that ages and stages, great that it's done by a qualified trained professional. It's not always. There are some states where it's done by a child welfare professional who may be changing and that kind of thing, and it's like, here's the ages and stages form, fill it out, see what you think. And the problem is, These are kids who are highly mobile. They're going from one placement to another placement to another placement. So it is very difficult to track the development of these children. It's hard to know, right? I have a girl and a boy, right? The boy who's now 18, so this is, but when he growled for about 3 years. He didn't talk, he just growled. He didn't do much else. So so that's what I'm saying. Everybody's always different in terms of sort of developmental and what it should look like and what it does look like. So
I just want to add to that, it's more than just if they use ages and stages or another tool. We're saying to have that parental input, foster input,
Right.
medical records, that they pass newborn hearing screening,
Right.
court records. So it's many sources that you're looking at with screening.
So few issues just to highlight here. So consent is sometimes an issue. Failure to conduct, the multidisciplinary evaluation, which we're going to talk about in a moment, why that's multidisciplinary, why that's important. And tracking children. That's very, very hard to do when they're moving from one place to another. It's very, very hard to track them. To say, well, they seemed okay. So when you do this initial screen and you say, well, they seem okay, but I need to track them later. I don't know if you could speak to that issue, but that's a very, very difficult thing to do because by the time you're trying as the agency to see where they are and to say, okay, well, I see you need to be evaluated. It's been 3 months, it's been 6 months. It's hard to locate them. Is that?
Yeah. I mean, that can be a factor. Again, if they're a state board, it's much easier. We don't really have that issue. But I think they're pretty creative. They're not a state board, and the service coordinators are pretty creative at trying to contact the child care provider. If they don't get it, the family's still using that child care provider. A lot of the communities are rural, so they just kind of know where their families are based upon, going to church and different things like that, and that community contact that they can locate the families. But it always is a factor at some level that if we want to touch base back with it, we'll call the doctor's office. We do things like call WID, the doctor's office, the local county health department too, about have you seen the child lately, the family, we need to do another evaluation. So they're pretty creative in trying to make some community contacts, but yeah, there's always a level of this. They just fall off the radar screen and we can't find them.
And often the medical professional community is actually a very good place to do that tracking because they keep records and they have time when they have the family coming back in. So you need multiple systems looking at these kids. It's not enough for the caseworker or the school district. They may be in the school district then, but then they move somewhere else. So you need sort of multiple systems that are looking at this. So that's really important. And to talk about parental involvement is another issue and providing the services. So I think we've already covered this in terms of who's responsible 0 to 3, Nebraska Early Development Network, and then 3 to 5, we're looking at the school district, who may be sort of outsourcing it to another, no, there's no outsourcing.
No, it's birth to 21 is school district.
Okay.
Our state, we're birth mandate.
Okay. So, Board of Education of every school district, just as you said, shall provide or contract for special education programs, transportation, all those things. All of that. So who can refer? I think we've gone over this, but hospitals, parents, daycare centers, all of that. And then we have certain agencies that have an obligation to refer. So just to keep reminding everyone, the process doesn't end with the referral, that doesn't solve it. So referrals we talked about, how it's going very, very well here, and I think that might be in part because you implemented that system, or maybe it was going well before that. I don't know.
It wasn't going well. That's why we did the automation. We were down to 35%.
That's a very, very model system. That's terrific. Thank you. That's really great. So referral, though, does not mean permission to evaluate. We keep going back to the same thing about the consent. Agency must get permission. I'm using agency, I mean school district, just because okay? Must get permission from the child's parents to conduct the evaluation. Parent consent must be informed, voluntary, and written, right? So upon referral, then the agency must appoint a service coordinator and all of the rest starts to go into play. But that parent consent is very, very critical, is really, really important. And I think that wanted to mention Boston, Massachusetts, and some other places have developed tools to communicate with parents, to explain in a very positive manner about early intervention, what it means and why it's so important for their child and that kind of thing. To have a way to do that is important to that. Oops. And just so that we're clear, so upon referral, the agency must appoint a service coordinator within 45 days to complete multidisciplinary evaluation, and this is for children who are deemed eligible. We're going through that in a moment. Developed a service plan. It's called an IFSP, not an IEP, but it's the same in terms of it's kind of the contract of what services will be provided. It's developed with the family. All of the services are provided in home to make it sort of a normal, natural environment and all of that. Plan for further assessment and tracking if the child is at risk but not eligible for services. So that tracking is really critical for kids in care. So we talked a little bit about the child find duty, the legal duty to locate eligible children, including children who are homeless in the wards of the state, and then I read before from the Nebraska law as well. Mandatory referrals for evaluation. The state must have a system to refer child if substantial case of abuse, neglect, and all of that. So that's from the federal law. And then I read to you before from the state law.
I've got a question. Who's gonna? Mr. Herzog and I have a case in Holt County where I have a child that's just over a year old. The child was a product of incest and statutory rape by a half-sibling who is sibling. They have, and the parents are out. The father, the 17-year-old male, relinquished as he's being charged with felony, incest, and rape. Mother has a condition, Tom, help me out, what is this? It's cerebral palsy, anyway, from birth. I mean, she is 24 years old and doesn't know anything. So her parental rights were terminated. This child has no parents to consent. Who consents?
The school district in that case.
Excuse me?
The school district in that case should appoint a surrogate parent to be the foster parent, and the foster parent would sign it.
And the foster parent is undergoing a changing right now. At this moment, it's shifting.
But the obligation remains for the school district to appoint a surrogate parent. It does not need to be the foster parent. It needs to be someone who will serve in that role. So the school district has an obligation to.
The foster parent was the grandmother, the mother of these two children. I'm not going, but we have a case. We have a county court abuse and neglect case underway.
It seems duplicative to get the school involved when that baby has a GAL in a juvenile case.
Where the school is responsible is to pay for any cost for evaluation and to make sure that that happens. But I think that maybe the guardian ad litem could give permission, or I mean, they need to work together, but it's the school district's responsibility to pay for any evaluation.
So Amy, that child is in Atkinson, it's being moved to O'Neill.
I just want to clarify one point. The GAL would not give permission in that situation. The GAL could be appointed by a court to actually take on that role. But a GAL does not automatically step into the position of providing that consent. A court, however, can make that happen.
Can the school appoint the GAL?
Yes.
The school can absolutely appoint a GAL.
What we need to decide is which school. I guess what Frosty's saying is the child was in one school district and apparently the new foster parent is in a different school district.
What usually, and it may be different here, it is where the child is then residing. It doesn't go to the school district with the biological parent whose rights have been terminated would be residing. It would be where the child resides. It is that school district that has the child find obligation.
So then it becomes a matter of communication. When a child such as that moves into a school district, someone needs to notify someone at the district level, and then they can appoint an educational surrogate or, the foster parent.
In many instances, it's the caseworker who is notifying the school district that there is a child who now lives in their district who will need the appointment of a surrogate parent.
Well, the answer to this is probably obvious to you, but it's not obvious to me. If we have this automated electronic notification, which is 100%
That's just to refer
That's just to refer.
that class of cases to someone who will do, you know, who will ensure that the early intervention screening is done.
Now,
Sorry.
how do we get that child on that list so that it gets?
Well, I think, from one of you explained how the referrals come in. I think you're getting some referrals, you may not be getting all referrals, and that's a really important point to make.
Couple things, you know, these are system issues, so these are good. What really should have happened in your particular case, in your particular case, is early on, the child protection service worker should have made a referral over immediately. We should never be waiting for us to go into a database and code it in. It should be happening up front, just like when you're setting up a placement, you're setting up visitation, you're setting up whatever services for the family. You need to then, in your little checklist, I know you have them, I had one, add captive referral for children under the age of 3. And you fill out a captive referral, you all have it in your offices. If you don't call me, I'll get it to you. But there's a form you can fill out, you can do it on Infocus itself. There's a little narrative box, you can fill out a captive referral and send it over. So that's what should have happened in the first place. Okay, but now you're later on in the case, and if this worker still hasn't went in and substantiated it on their database, it hasn't come to us. I'm hoping, though, we really do have this case. But let's say tomorrow you go back and you can call. You can call. Yeah, I can help you with that, or you could call the local office tomorrow and make the referral if we haven't gotten it. Okay, so now what needs to happen is the CPS worker, because it's a state board, there's a system in place for this, and I can tell you what it is. There is a state board notification letter that goes to the superintendent. So every time a child birth to 21 is made a state board, every CPS worker needs to fill this out, birth to 21. And it's to notify the local school district that the child was made a state board and whether or not the education, whether or not the parental rights are intact, and whether or not the parent wants to participate in the educational process for their child. So the caseworker fills it out and sends it over to the local district superintendent's office. Now when we get that, we're going to see that the parental rights have been terminated. We know right away that that district has to appoint a surrogate, right, immediately, so that we can begin services. That's why all these things are so critical. We need all this information, that you won't be having these questions like you are right now. It all goes back to all of us working together and communicating. So that's the next thing. After I check for you tomorrow or Thursday, then what we're going to do is we're going to work with the caseworker to get that letter over to the superintendent's office so we can immediately appoint a surrogate.
But this actually highlights an important problem. That's why everyone needs to know about early intervention services, the court, the child advocate, the GAL, the parent attorney. Everybody needs to know that this exists, so that there are more than one check on the system. So that if something might actually fall through the cracks and the caseworker does make the referral, everyone knows how the system works and can pick up the ball that was dropped. So I think that's really an important point. So I am going to try to switch over to this. So these are the areas of developmental delay that we're always looking at: cognition, communication, social and emotional, adaptive behavior, physical, including vision or hearing. So those are the primary places that we are looking for 0 to 3. Developmental delay defined, 25% of child's age, or that means age-appropriate skill level. The appropriate diagnostic instruments and procedures, test rate below 1.5 standard deviation below mean. This may be a little bit different in your state. This is what is usually. If you have a different definition, if you could explain what that is, that'd be great. Thank God.
That used to be our set definition, but no, there is no set definition. This is just a guideline now for school districts, for children, for developmental delay, and so it isn't absolute, and it varies from different states, but anyway, Nebraska does not have a set absolute required development.
Which is actually a good thing. It is a positive thing because in that instance, they're then identifying more children who may be at risk, who may need these services. If you have a very, very strict definition, those are the states, according to the National Governors Association, there's a lot here, that you're less likely to be capturing all the children who really are needing these services and interventions. So diagnosed physical mental condition that has a high probability of resulting in delay. These are just some examples. It is not an exhaustive list. Informed clinical opinion. Make sure the medical community is very, very involved in these referrals. It's very, very important because they're the ones who will be able to identify a lot of these kids. Again, other examples, high probability of developmental delays. Here's your list, chromosomal abnormalities, all of those. So that's important. So the universe of kids that may be eligible for early intervention services is much larger than that one CAPTA definition that we were referring to when we started this discussion. This is presumptive eligibility according to guidelines. Again, not exhaustive, but these are the ones that are, it's presumptive that those children who have any of those particular conditions or diagnoses are eligible for early intervention services. It's a presumption of eligibility standard. So multidisciplinary evaluation, it's conducted, initial evaluation must be performed by someone not involved in providing services to the child. So that's interesting. So it's not supposed to be, although it is in some sense, the caseworker who's doing the screening, that kind of thing. Based on informed clinical opinion, may be based on informed clinical opinion, not a requirement. Conducted by persons trained in doing these assessments must be non-discriminatory. Information must be provided in parents' native language. Must include a view of relevant health status history, child's level of functioning, unique needs in each developmental area, voluntary family assessment. You do interviews, you talk to people, you try to assess. It's a very, very full and rich multidisciplinary evaluation that is then conducted. So you've got the referral, you've got the screen, and you've got the multidisciplinary evaluation that's conducted. The timelines must be done in a time for an IFS to be developed within 45 days of referral. Do you use the standard 45 days?
45 calendar days.
Right, calendar days. Important point, should have been in there. 45 calendar days of referral. If you can't complete in time, the early intervention agency must document why it's created interim IFSP, must conduct multidisciplinary evaluations at least annually. It is far more frequent for children with younger ages. Is it here, or is it the end?
It's every 3 years we do a multidisciplinary evaluation.
Okay, not annually.
No, but we do assessments at least every 6 months.
Okay. And written report to the services in 30 days of essentially what services does this child need. And you may provide services while awaiting evaluation if it's very, very clear that the child needs something that is appearing over there.
In Nebraska, you'll get the written reports, the written MDC, and the written IFSP plan within 7 days after the meeting is held with the channel. 7 days.
And that's in compliance with the new amended regulations. So this, I think we actually reviewed ad nauseam before about why this is happening, but it's really important to look at this. 68% referrals not receive multidisciplinary evaluations. So the 10% are screened out, right? So that sounds about right, 10%. Because not every child will be, need these services. The 35% parent withdrew, refused to participate in the process, correct? And then we have 25% unable to locate. Maybe those two, I think, the 35%, the 21%, there may be things that we can do to make that a little bit better. And then 1%, they went out of state, so that would not be a problem. Yes?
Oh, it's just a comment on the parents not refusing the evaluation. Because I think really what I see a lot of times happening is parents are afraid that you're going to go in and see something that's delayed with their child, and so they have a fear that it's going to look bad against their case.
Yeah,
my
I
child
think that's
is delayed, so and which brings up the point, I'm not sure that they're the best advocate for their child in that position to give or not give that consent.
Well, one thing was interesting in that Massachusetts model of communicating with parents. What they underscored was telling parents, this is not anything that you did. This is not going to come back and be a problem for you. In fact, it's the opposite. It shows that you want to ensure that your child is able to learn and to develop and to grow. It's a positive for your child. It will help the relationship with your child. It will help reunification with your child if you're in that situation. So it's very, very important, the messaging, I think, that all of us do with parents, in the courtroom, through attorneys, about early intervention services. It cannot go back and bite you in the butt in any way. It cannot be, I know the perception, I think that's very, very important and valid, and it's exactly what does happen, and why we may be seeing that sort of high percentage. But some of that is in the messaging that we do. That's another issue why in our court, like in Pennsylvania, where we have the juvenile court rules and courts are looking at early intervention services specifically, they're putting it as part of the findings that was a great thing that the parent did by getting early intervention services, and they documented in the court findings and in the records. And it's being reported by the caseworker, reported by parent attorneys that this was a positive thing that they're doing. So I think that's a really, really important point. So I think we talked about some of the barriers that are here in terms of identifying. So this is the other issue. This was 1/3 of early intervention problems are initially reported by caseworkers and our foster parents. That comes out of the statistic that, yes, we're referring the abuse and neglect. That's not saying that caseworkers are doing their job and making those referrals. I'm not trying to say that. It's that there is something else falling through the cracks here. We have a number of children who are developmentally delayed or at high risk of developmental delays. And those, they're not mandatory referrals, but they are needed for this population, this very, very vulnerable, at-risk population of children. This changes their trajectory. If you can intervene now, it will mean so much more to this child later. You know, we have 40% of kids who are in the dependency system nationwide that are in the special education system. And part of that goes back to this. It goes back to the fact that some kids may have needed these early intervention systems. And it's one thing about the kids who have a substantial case of abuse and neglect. It's also when you walk into the family and you're interacting with multiple members of the family. You may have come in because something is going on with Johnny, but you see Mary over in the corner, and it doesn't, and something will hit you that this is a kid who may be developmentally late. The infant who's sitting there and no one's responding. All of those things, we need to kind of open ourselves to looking at those kids as well, because those are the kids who need and are entitled. It's a legal entitlement to this intervention that is so critical and so important. It is life-saving and it is cost-saving. So, other problems, other issues and barriers, lack of a consistent caregiver. We don't have the same person looking at the child. So it's hard to see what is going on developmentally. Lack of access to health care. We really rely on the medical community to do some of these referrals with respect to early intervention, and sometimes those appointments are not kept, and that is not really going on, and those referrals aren't coming in. Parental consent participation is required. Parents are sometimes unknown and unfound. It's not like sometimes they are known, they are found, but it's difficult. But also to track, sort of to make sure that there's a system in place for knowing where families will be, to make sure that there's follow-up on that. Professionals are familiar with child welfare policies, and that's another issue, to educate medical community about that, and about strategies, and the importance of engaging families. When I was looking at, I guess it was New Mexico, and also Kansas has been doing a lot about, in Boston, Massachusetts too, they thought that their primary problem was parent engagement, and they decided that that's what they really wanted to focus on. A number of states are also meeting on a continual basis with child welfare and early intervention to make sure that that is happening monthly, to try to figure out what the barriers are, what the problems are, and how to address them in a systemic manner. So, just to remind everyone, this is the special education landscape. Early intervention is part of IDEA, it's part C, right, of IDEA. So it's part of the special education process. It's a parent-driven system. And so the parent, if you don't have an active involved decision maker, is a problem. Child find is about knowledge. How well do we know, these children? Because they're just coming in like in a flash, right? There's some sort of emergency that happens, and then we're dealing with these children. There isn't sometimes a person who feels like giving you that information. Were they of low birth weight? You're asking the parent. Were you drug abused? You know, these are really, really difficult things. So we need to have a way to communicate with parents and say, it doesn't matter what happened in the past, except that we need to help this child now. And to make that relationship and that engagement something positive in order to lead the child. And just remember that this is the most important, remember nothing from this, that time is really of the essence of this kid. It makes a huge difference. If we don't intervene now, it is really a horrible cost to them later. So this talks about the parent landscape. Parents are part of the involuntary process. So that's the other thing. You have to remember, parents are being asked to consent to this. They're saying, here, we want your child to be evaluated for these services. And they're part of it involuntary in some cases, the process at that time. And it's difficult to get folks to consent to something when they're in this very involuntary process. To make sure it's warned. So to understand the importance of early intervention and communication and all of those things. So as child welfare, to make sure that it's not just referral, but it's following up and being part of that tracking system, and communicating and supporting parents is key in ongoing communication, and to provide all the information that's needed for a really effective multidisciplinary evaluation. The caseworkers are a very, very important part of that, to make sure that that helps. And to use the court to appoint the decision maker to consent, if that's a problem. Okay, so I think we have actually covered all of this. We've covered the surrogate parent rules, I'm totally out of time here. We've covered parent rights. We've covered all of that. The tracking services that happen. The IFSP, the Individualized Family Service Plan that's developed that talk about the services that your child will receive. And it addresses all of these issues. We've got a team of individuals, the parent, the service coordinator, the person directly involved in the evaluation. It talks about where the services will happen. It looks at those 5 developmental areas. Talks about how often you will receive those services, what they will look like, where it should be in the natural environment, in the home, wherever the child is located. Whether services is directed to the child, and to the extent that there are consultation with others that are working with the child, which is a very key critical component for kids in the dependency system. Talks about and walks through all of the types of services, the special instructions, speech and language, occupational therapy, all of that is documented in there. And then, of course, you need parental consent for the services as well. It's not just obviously for the evaluation of the services, but we have those timelines that are a little bit different here. In Nebraska, we talked about 7 days, correct? Just walk through that.
For services, they must start within 30 days of parental consent on the IFSP for the service.
Okay, so it's 30, not 14. Okay. And they are reviewed every 6 months.
At least every 6 months.
All right, and options for dispute resolution, which might be different here, but essentially they follow your special education law, and you have those dispute resolution process, an administrative process, a mediation process, all of that. So filing a due complaint, you file a due process request, all of those rights that are in place for children who are in special education apply with equal force to kids who are under part of state. The right to resolve the dispute and all of that. So just so that we were clear on the early intervention services, we're up to age 3, Part C, and then 3 and 5 is actually Part B. So that then goes to the school evaluation. But here it's also right? And then the transition, that's also an important part of the early intervention system to ensure that from 3 to beginners that you're really looking at this. This talk today was really focusing on 0 to 3, but to know that it's very, very important that you have that transition because a child is usually going from one system to another, although it's a little bit slightly different. So that's important to look at. And to look at this preschool early intervention, that's how we refer to it as opposed to the 0 to 3. And so these are all to make sure that that transition process before the child turns 3, the IFSP must address the child's transitional needs. The parent consent past IFSP and evaluations are shared with the preschool early intervention agency, in this case the school district is doing that. And so that transition is smooth, going from 0 to 3 and going from 3 to advise the preschool. And get all of that in terms of the transition process that you've identified within 60 years of your birthday are evaluated by the preschool, or if you're doing but you're not doing that here. It's a seamless thing.
It's still distributed for birth candy.
Ignore that completely. So you have the automatic path referrals, which are happening, so that's terrific. Have a system for tracking children across multiple systems. So if you have databases that are able to communicate with each other, then you can find the families that sometimes get lost in the mix. If you have multiple ways of having and sharing that information with regard to where the parents are, so that's really important. Have a system and information to send to the parents that's parent-friendly. System for promptly appointing a parent when needed to do that. So that's it, guys. Thank you so much, everybody.